From the moment I got engaged, I anticipated some bumps in the road, maybe a few disagreements over floral arrangements or table settings. What I didn't expect was a calculated attempt to ruin my big day, orchestrated by none other than my soon-to-be brother-in-law and his equally conniving fiancée. My name is Kelly, I'm 24, and I recently tied the knot with my high school sweetheart James, who's 25. He's the most thoughtful, hardworking, and supportive person I've ever known. But his older brother Brad, he's like a constant pebble in your shoe, irritating, relentless, and impossible to ignore. Brad is 27 and has always been their parents' golden boy, the kind who somehow skates through life without ever facing real consequences. James has told me countless stories from their childhood, stories where Brad would cause chaos and somehow manage to make James take the fall every single time. If Brad broke something, James got blamed. If Brad lied, it was James who got punished. Their mom would wave it off with a lazy, "boys will be boys," brushing away any real accountability, like it was dust on a shelf. It didn't stop in childhood. If James received a new gift, Brad found a way to break it or claim it for himself. If James made a friend, Brad would step in with his practiced charm and effectively steal that person's attention, leaving James out in the cold. And when adolescence came around, Brad stepped up his game. He made fun of James's kind-hearted nature, calling him names like mama's boy or softy in front of friends. James tried to shrug it off with a smile, ever the peacekeeper, but I could always see the pain flicker in his eyes. Unlike James, who is driven and responsible, Brad's life is a revolving door of failure and excuses. He jumps from job to job, never staying long enough to make a mark. He strolls into work late and acts baffled when anyone dares to call him out. There's this arrogance about him, like he thinks the rules just don't apply, and yet, somehow, his parents still defend him with the same tired lines. Brad's just figuring things out, they'll say, like being inconsiderate and unreliable is a temporary phase he'll magically grow out of. When it comes to relationships, Brad's pattern is no better. He's dated more women than I can count, and every single relationship ends the same way, with the woman walking away, often after enduring a whirlwind of charm followed by manipulation and emotional chaos. Brad knows how to put on a show. He's good-looking, smooth-talking, and radiates that kind of false confidence that draws people in. But once he has them, the mask slips, revealing a controlling, manipulative man who excels at gaslighting. Then came Stephanie. 6 months before our wedding, Brad introduced a new woman to the family during a backyard barbecue. We were all expecting yet another fleeting flame, someone who'd disappear before the next holiday rolled around. But Stephanie wasn't just another face in Brad's revolving door of girlfriends. She was different, and not in a good way. From the second she stepped onto the patio, you could feel the energy shift. She carried herself with a sense of superiority, like she was gracing us with her presence, rather than being a guest at a casual family gathering. She didn't smile warmly or try to get to know anyone. Her eyes scanned the crowd with calculated scrutiny, like she was evaluating everyone's worth. The first thing she said to me wasn't "Hi" or "Nice to meet you." No, she walked straight up to me and James and said, "Oh, so you're Kelly, huh? I thought you'd be taller." I blinked in surprise, let out a nervous chuckle, unsure if she was joking. But James stepped in immediately. He put his arm around me and looked her square in the eye. "Kelly's perfect the way she is," he said firmly. Stephanie just smirked and replied, "I was just saying." That exchange told me everything I needed to know about her. Stephanie was a master at backhanded compliments and subtle jabs disguised as innocent remarks. At first glance, you might think she was just a bit socially awkward or blunt, but spend a little time around her and it became glaringly clear this woman was cold, calculated, and out for herself. She had a knack for zeroing in on people's vulnerabilities. She once told James's mother, "You must have been stunning when you were younger," and then followed up with, "Brad always says you used to be the prettiest woman in town." Another time, she asked James's dad if he was finally going to retire and enjoy life, fully aware that he'd just been laid off and was struggling to find work. Her words always came with a smile, but the sting they left behind was unmistakable. And the most baffling part? Brad adored her. He stood next to her, grinning proudly, like he'd found his perfect match. In a twisted way, he had. They were alike in all the worst ways, petty, self-centered, and constantly craving attention. Together, they fed off the drama they stirred up, always making sure the spotlight never drifted too far away. Stephanie wasn't just another mean girl. She was strategic. Over the next few months, every interaction we had with her seemed engineered to spark conflict. She wouldn't directly insult people. No, that would be too obvious. Instead, she planted little seeds of doubt, whispered subtle gossip, and then watched the tension build like a slow-moving fire. She'd smile sweetly while the people around her argued or second-guessed themselves, all while her hands remained ostensibly clean. One night at a family dinner, she looked over at James and said, You must have been such a mama's boy growing up. You're so gentle and sensitive." Her tone was syrupy sweet, like she was complimenting him. But Brad seized the moment and laughed. "Oh, you don't even know the half of it," he said. "He used to cry if Mom didn't cut the crusts off his sandwiches." The entire table erupted into laughter, and James forced a smile, trying not to let it show how much it hurt. That was Stephanie's game, disguising cruelty as concern, ridicule as flattery. And Brad? He lapped it up like she was the cleverest, most delightful woman to ever walk the earth. Their dynamic was toxic, and as our wedding day approached, I began to sense that whatever storm they were brewing wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Everyone laughed, but I could clearly see the discomfort in James's eyes. Stephanie, of course, just smiled sweetly, pretending to be blissfully unaware that she had just triggered the whole exchange. That was her signature move. Say something cutting, then act as if butter wouldn't melt in her mouth. Another thing I noticed early on was Stephanie's obsession with always being on top. She had an almost compulsive need to overshadow others. If someone mentioned a new job, an award, or any personal success, she'd immediately find a way to divert the conversation to herself or Brad. It was so transparent, yet somehow she did it without ever seeming overtly rude. It was like she had perfected the art of competitive small talk. One evening during a casual family dinner, James proudly shared that he'd been promoted at work. Everyone cheered, clapping and congratulating him. Everyone, that is, except Stephanie. She gave a slow clap, leaned into Brad, and with a pouty voice said, "Didn't you almost get that promotion last year, babe? Honestly, you totally deserved it more than that idiot boss of yours." It was obvious she couldn't stand anyone else being celebrated, not even for a moment. What solidified my growing unease about her, though, was how she began inserting herself into James's mother's life. At first it seemed harmless. She'd tag along for lunch outings, pop over for tea, offer to help with errands. I assumed she was trying to get close to the family, maybe win some points. But the change in James's mom soon became noticeable. She started making little digs like, "You should call more often, James. Brad always finds time to check in," which was laughable, considering Brad only called when he needed a favor. The truth came out during a chat with James's sister, Emma. She revealed that during those one-on-one moments with their mother, Stephanie had been playing her own subtle game of manipulation. She'd casually drop lines like, "Brad was just saying how much he appreciates everything you've done for him," or "He's so worried about your future. He's always talking about how he wants to make sure you're looked after." All lies, of course. But to someone craving a little appreciation, it probably felt good to hear. And slowly, it started working. Their mom began viewing Brad in a softer light, while James was subtly cast as the distant son. And then, in true Brad and Stephanie fashion, they dropped their big engagement announcement. Let me paint you the picture. A highly filtered Instagram photo of Stephanie's manicured hand, the diamond ring sparkling like it was auditioning for a movie role. The caption, "When you know, you know," followed by hashtags like power couple goals and better than a fairy tale. It was so overdone, so perfectly theatrical, that James and I couldn't stop laughing when we saw it. But the timing wasn't just suspicious, it was calculated. Brad proposed right after James privately told his family that he was planning to propose to me. Coincidence? Not a chance. Brad couldn't stand the thought of James outshining him, and Stephanie? I'd bet money she reveled in the attention shift. What stung even more was how they behaved afterward. When James and I finally got engaged, it was pure joy for us. We were excited to share it with the people we loved, but as soon as we made our announcement, Brad and Stephanie immediately made it about themselves. Stephanie squealed, "Oh my gosh, maybe we'll all get married in the same year, that would be so cute." Brad, with that smug grin plastered on his face, added, "Guess we're just a family of overachievers, huh?" And from that moment on, wedding planning became Stephanie's full-time personality. Every time we saw her, she somehow looped the conversation back to her wedding, her venue, her theme, her dress fittings, her honeymoon plans. If someone admired my engagement ring, Stephanie would chime in about how hers had been custom designed overseas. If I mentioned booking a caterer, she'd start detailing the 5-course meal she was planning for her reception. But it wasn't just self-promotion. She was slyly undermining us. At one dinner, she pulled me aside and said in a faux sincere tone, "You're going to love wedding planning. It's so stressful but totally worth it. Just make sure it doesn't take over your whole life." Then she added, "Oh, and if I were you, I'd steer clear of pastels. They're super overdone these days." I hadn't even told anyone what colors I was considering, but yes, I had been leaning toward pastels. It was around this time that I started to realize just how little Stephanie actually knew about Brad. She talked about him like he was some kind of rare, untouchable gem. "Brad just has such high standards," she once told me. "That's why he never settled down before me." I had to fight the urge to laugh out loud. High standards. Brad had dated more women than I could count, and had cheated on more than a few. He wasn't picky, he was reckless and impulsive. Stephanie was living in some carefully curated fantasy, completely oblivious to who he really was. But I knew that bubble wouldn't last forever. She wanted the spotlight, the drama, the attention, and she'd get it, just not the way she expected. You see, by this point, Brad and Stephanie's antics had become exhausting. They weren't just trying to share our joy, they were trying to steal it. And when our engagement party rolled around, they took things a step too far. James and I had planned a small gathering, nothing extravagant, just close friends, family, some music, delicious food, and good energy. We wanted to be intimate and meaningful. Of course, we invited Brad and Stephanie. They were family, after all, and not inviting them would have created unnecessary drama, or so we thought. Looking back, we should have known better. Looking back, I truly wish we had accidentally forgotten to send Brad and Stephanie an invitation to our engagement party. It was painfully obvious from the moment they arrived that they weren't there to celebrate us. They were there to soak up attention and shift the focus to themselves. Stephanie strutted in wearing this glitter-drenched, skin-tight dress that screamed for all eyes to be on her. It was more suited for a red carpet than a casual backyard celebration. Brad followed close behind with his signature smug grin plastered on his face, like he was walking into a press conference instead of a family event. Within minutes, they had already split up and were making rounds, chatting with anyone who'd listen. I overheard Stephanie gushing to one of James's aunts. "We're just so excited to tie the knot before the year's over. It's going to be the wedding of the century." She conveniently left out the fact that their engagement had been hastily announced right after James shared his plans to propose to me. Because, of course, Brad couldn't handle being upstaged. But that night wasn't just another display of attention-seeking. It turned into something far worse. Halfway through the evening, I ducked into the laundry room to grab some extra napkins. On my way back to the main area, I paused when I heard voices echoing from the hallway near our guest bedroom. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but I instantly recognized Brad's voice. Curiosity, and let's be honest, a bit of suspicion got the better of me. I stopped quietly, staying out of sight. What I heard chilled me. Brad and Stephanie weren't just making casual, snide comments. They were actively scheming. Brad's tone was low but intense. "We've got to make sure our wedding is the one people remember," he said. "They think they're so perfect, but we'll show everyone who really runs this family." Stephanie giggled in response. "Don't worry, babe," she purred. "I've got a plan. We'll make her think we're rooting for her wedding, be all supportive and sweet, and then when her big day comes, we'll hit her where it hurts." I stood there frozen, my heart pounding in disbelief. They weren't just being petty or competitive. They were deliberately plotting to sabotage the happiest day of our lives. As I listened, the extent of their plan became clearer and more disturbing. Stephanie wanted to worm her way into my bridal party's good graces. She said, "I'll get in close with her bridesmaids, make them think I'm being helpful. Then, I'll stir things up, pit them against each other. They'll be too busy bickering to focus on the wedding." Brad chimed in with his own devious idea. He wanted to manipulate James's parents into pressuring us to expand the guest list, adding distant relatives, vague acquaintances, and even a few of his shady friends. The goal was chaos, plain and simple. But the most disturbing part was Stephanie's grand finale. She wanted to deliver a surprise speech at our reception, pretending it was a heartfelt tribute. In reality, it would be a performance designed to humiliate me in front of everyone. "I'll make her look like a total bridezilla," she laughed. "People will be talking about it for years." I felt sick. My stomach twisted into knots, and my hands clenched at my sides as they continued to mock and plan. To them, this was entertainment, a game to be won by tearing others down. When they finally left the hallway and returned to the party, I slipped back into the crowd, pretending everything was normal. I didn't want to cause a scene, not yet. Later that night, after the last guests had left, I pulled James aside and told him everything I'd heard. At first, he was skeptical. Maybe they were joking, he said, trying to give them the benefit of the doubt. But when I repeated their words verbatim, his face went pale. "They're unbelievable," he muttered. "Why can't they just be happy for us?" We stayed up for hours, weighing our options. James wanted to confront them immediately, but I knew how that would end. Brad and Stephanie would twist the story, deny everything, and turn the blame on us. They were masters at playing the victim. So instead, I proposed something different. Let them think they've gotten away with it. Let them believe we were clueless. James agreed to play it cool. He would keep his distance from Brad, while I'd remain polite but detached around Stephanie. Meanwhile, I began my own quiet counteroffensive. If they wanted to play dirty, I'd play smarter. I started with Brad's past. I knew he had a long list of ex-girlfriends, many of whom had left under dramatic and painful circumstances. I figured some of them might be willing to share their experiences and maybe, just maybe, help me expose the truth about the man Stephanie thought she was marrying. Finding them wasn't difficult. Social media is a powerful tool. I reached out with care, explaining who I was and why I was contacting them. To my surprise, nearly all of them were eager to talk. Turns out Brad had burned a lot of bridges. One of the first women I spoke to was Amy. She recounted how Brad had cheated on her with not one but two women simultaneously. He made me feel like I was going crazy for even suspecting it, she told me. He lied so smoothly I doubted myself. I feel bad for Stephanie. She doesn't know what she's walking into. Another woman, Becca, actually laughed when I explained what I was planning. "Oh, I'm in," she said. "That guy deserves everything coming to him." Within a few days, I had assembled a mini alliance, a group chat filled with Brad's scorned exes. These women were not only smart and strong, but also absolutely hilarious. The way they roasted Brad's old antics had me in stitches. It was like a backstage comedy roast. This wasn't just revenge, it was a reckoning. We coordinated stories, gathered receipts, screenshots, texts, pictures, evidence that would crush the illusion Brad had worked so hard to maintain. By the time their wedding invitations were sent out, I was more than ready. And the best part? Stephanie still had no idea. She genuinely believed she was marrying some noble, misunderstood hero, a modern-day prince who just needed the right woman to bring out his best self. She had no clue that her fairy tale was about to come crashing down. For a brief moment, I almost felt a flicker of sympathy for Stephanie, almost. But then I remembered the smug laughter in her voice when she talked about humiliating me on my own wedding day. Whatever shred of compassion I had quickly vanished. She had made her choices. Now it was time for her to live with them. Their wedding was set a full month before ours, and unsurprisingly, it was being hyped up like a royal event. Brad and Stephanie boasted about every detail, from the ritzy venue to the star-studded guest list, to how it was going to be absolutely unforgettable. Stephanie, in particular, couldn't help but drop little condescending comments my way. One afternoon, as we ran into each other at a family gathering, she gave me that tight-lipped smile of hers and said, "Wedding planning is so stressful. I'm sure yours will be cute in its own way." The tone was syrupy, but the message was clear. She saw my wedding as second-rate. I just smiled, biting back every snarky comeback that danced on the tip of my tongue. She had no clue what was coming. Brad and Stephanie thought they could manipulate, humiliate, and bulldoze their way into the spotlight without consequence, but they were about to learn that some games have high stakes, and their little performance was headed toward an epic finale. Let me walk you through Brad and Stephanie's wedding day, a spectacular train wreck that I had the immense satisfaction of watching unfold from the front row. James and I arrived dressed simply, elegantly. I wore a modest dress in soft navy, and James looked effortlessly sharp in his tailored gray suit. We blended into the crowd, not wanting to draw attention. After all, we were there to play the role of polite family members. Inside, though, I was practically shaking with anticipation. The venue was nothing short of extravagant. A sprawling estate with massive floral arches at every turn, gold-trimmed table settings, and a string quartet serenading the guests as they arrived. Crystal chandeliers sparkled from above, and every corner of the place screamed, "Look how much money we spent." Stefan's father clearly footed the bill, sparing no expense. Brad, meanwhile, strutted through the crowd like he had earned it all himself, smiling, shaking hands, posing for photos like he was the guest of honor at a charity gala. James and I took our seats near the back, exchanging quiet pleasantries with the other guests. All around us, people murmured about how perfect the setup was, how stunning Stephanie would look, how in love they seemed. It was almost laughable. They had no idea what was about to go down. The ceremony began with dramatic flair. The groomsmen entered in military formation, the bridesmaids floating in like pastel-colored swans. Then, finally, Stephanie made her grand entrance. Her dress was so encrusted with sequins it could have doubled as a disco ball, and the smug satisfaction on her face radiated through the room. She moved slowly, deliberately, soaking in every admiring glance like it was oxygen. Brad stood at the altar, grinning like he'd just won the lottery. For the first 10 minutes, everything went off without a hitch. The officiant welcomed everyone and launched into the usual opening statements about love and unity. Brad and Stephanie stood side by side, fingers interlaced, basking in the adoration. And then, Amy stood up. She rose gracefully from her seat in the backy elegant, poised and dressed in a floor-length burgundy gown that could have easily passed for bridesmaid attire. For a brief second, everyone assumed she was part of the ceremony, perhaps delivering a reading or a blessing. But as she walked directly toward the altar, the air shifted. She stopped a foot from Brad and Stephanie, her voice clear and unwavering. "Brad," she said, her eyes locked on his face. "Before you make any vows today, I think everyone deserves to know the kind of promises you've already broken." The room froze. You could practically hear the collective intake of breath. Brad's confident smile vanished, his complexion draining to ash. Stephanie blinked in confusion, glancing from Amy to Brad, searching his expression for guidance. Amy, unfazed, reached into her clutch and produced an envelope, which she extended toward Brad. He stared at it, hesitant. But Stephanie, never one to let someone else control the narrative, snatched it from Amy's hand and ripped it open. Inside were pages of handwritten notes. "What is this?" she asked sharply, flipping through the sheets. "They're love letters," Amy replied, her tone icy but calm. "Letters Brad wrote to me while we were together, and also to several other women at the same time." The crowd erupted into hushed murmurs. Stephanie's hands trembled as she read line after line, her jaw tightening with each word. Brad lunged for the envelope, but Amy held firm. "You might want to let her finish," she said with a slight smile. "It gets better." That's when Becca stood up. She made her way confidently down the aisle, an envelope in hand and a gleam in her eye. Her voice, sweet with artificial sympathy, rang out. "Hi, Stephanie. I'm Becca. I dated Brad for about 6 months. During that time, he told me he was saving for our future. Turns out, he was just borrowing money from me to take another woman out." Stephanie's face went white. "Is this true?" she snapped at Brad. "How many of these are there?" Brad stumbled backward, his voice cracking. It's not what it looks like. They're lying." But more women were already rising. Lisa marched down next, her heels tapping like a countdown on marble. She handed Stephanie her envelope with a cold stare. "You don't know me," she said, "but I know Brad very well. He promised me the world while juggling a roster of side flings. Here's a list of them. He gave them cutesy nicknames in his phone to keep us from finding out." The officiant stood helplessly at the altar, clutching his binder of vows like it might shield him from the madness. Guests gasped and whispered, phones out, filming everything. Stephanie's parents exchanged horrified glances, whispering furiously as the perfect image of their future son-in-law collapsed in real time. Brad's parents sat stunned, their expressions blank with shock, as if they were only now seeing the son they had refused to believe could do wrong. And then Danielle stood. Danielle didn't carry a fancy envelope or a neatly printed letter. Instead, she held up a single sheet of paper, one that would add the final nail in the coffin. "This one's my personal favorite," she said with a satisfied smirk. The guests turned to look, curious. She raised it high, and even from a few rows back I recognized the format immediately. A screenshot of a dating app chat. "This," she said, her voice ringing out clearly, "is a conversation Brad and I had on Tinder while he was already living with one of his ex-girlfriends. Recognize it, Brad?" Gasps rippled through the crowd like thunder. Heads whipped around, and a wave of murmurs surged across the seated guests. Stephanie's face turned crimson as she stared at the screen, her jaw tightening with each passing second. With a furious shriek, she flung the collected envelopes onto the floor, the papers fluttering across the aisle like autumn leaves caught in a gust of scandal. "How could you?" she spat at Brad, her voice sharp and trembling. "Are all these women lying, or is this just one massive, disgusting coincidence?" Brad looked like a deer caught in high beams, sweat glistening at his hairline, lips parted in stunned silence. I can explain," he mumbled. "They're all just bitter, jealous. They're trying to ruin my life." Amy, arms crossed, took a step forward. "No, Brad," she said, her voice calm but laced with steel. "You ruined your own life. We're just making sure no one else ends up believing the lies you've spun." Despite the absolute chaos unraveling around her, Stephanie didn't storm off. No, she stood perfectly still, her chest heaving with fury as she glared at Brad like she was calculating whether or not murder in front of 150 witnesses was worth the prison time. "Fine," she said finally, her voice now a razor-thin thread of composure. "We'll deal with this later. Let's just finish the ceremony." The officiant, who by now looked like he'd aged 10 years in 20 minutes, cleared his throat and stepped forward. Shall we continue?" he asked tentatively, glancing between the bride and groom with visible apprehension. Brad gave a weak nod, while Stephanie managed the most strained smile I've ever seen. A few guests shuffled uncomfortably in their seats. Others had already stood up and quietly exited, unable or unwilling to watch the rest unfold. The ceremony limped on, devoid of the joy and warmth it was supposed to hold. The vows, which had clearly been painstakingly written to sound heartfelt and poetic, now sounded hollow and robotic. The once enchanted atmosphere was completely tainted, the air thick with gossip and disbelief. When it finally ended, the reception began, but by then no one cared about Brad and Stephanie's first dance or the 3-tiered cake. Every table buzzed with whispers about the exes, the letters, and the deluge of betrayal that had just been dumped like confetti at the altar. Guests glanced over at the couple with poorly hidden curiosity, phones in hand, recording bits of the aftermath. Stephanie and Brad tried to carry on, plastering on smiles, laughing too loudly, pretending nothing had happened. But the damage was irreparable. The illusion was shattered. The room they once controlled had turned on them. James and I stayed just long enough to soak in the awkwardness, then slipped out as quietly as we could, fighting back grins. Once we were safely back in our car, we laughed until we could barely breathe. The tears that streamed down our faces weren't from sadness, but from pure, satisfying justice. They wanted a wedding no one would forget, James chuckled between gasps, and boy, did they get their wish. You'd think after a catastrophe like that they'd vanish for a while, maybe take a vacation, go into hiding, move to another city where no one knew their story, but not Brad and Stephanie. Instead of lying low, they came out swinging. In the days following the wedding, James and I went about life as usual. We smiled through our workdays and whispered hilarious recaps to each other at night, resisting the urge to check the gossip threads that had started circulating online. The group chat with Brad's exes, however, was on fire. Memes, screenshots, commentary, it was a comedic goldmine. Apparently, the story had spread through their entire social circle. Everyone was talking about it. Stephanie's parents were furious, not because of Brad's deceit, but because of the sheer embarrassment they'd suffered in front of their elite, judgmental friends. By midweek, Stephanie broke her silence, passive-aggressively of course. She started posting vague messages on Instagram, cryptic quotes about fake friends, staying strong and never letting anyone steal your joy. Meanwhile, Brad decided subtlety wasn't his style. He posted a full-blown rant on Facebook about jealous, bitter women trying to sabotage true love, but how they had failed because... The comments section was pure chaos. Some of his more clueless friends rallied around him with generic words of support. Others weren't buying it, dropping thinly veiled comments hinting that maybe Brad wasn't as blameless as he claimed. James and I kept our social media interactions neutral, like a couple of posts here and there, staying just visible enough to deflect suspicion. But then, the probing began. It started with a random call from Brad. We were cooking dinner when James's phone lit up. He put it on speaker and we exchanged a knowing look. So, Brad began, his voice awkward. How'd you guys like the wedding? James played it cool. It was nice. Venue was beautiful. Yeah, thanks, Brad replied, a note of hesitation in his voice. So, you guys didn't notice anything weird? Like during the ceremony? James raised an eyebrow at me but kept his tone light. Weird? No, not really. Why? Oh, nothing, Brad said quickly. Just thought you might have heard some rumors or something. You know how people can be jealous. I nearly choked on my laughter. James shrugged, still cool as ice. Didn't hear anything. Everything seemed fine to me. Brad let out a forced laugh. Yeah, that's what I thought. Anyway, see you around. As soon as the call ended, we collapsed into another round of hysterical laughter. It was so obvious he was fishing and failing miserably. But the calls didn't stop there. Brad and Stephanie started asking around, probing relatives, messaging old friends, trying to sniff out who had set them up. Word trickled back to us that Stephanie suspected one of her bridesmaids, while Brad had his suspicions focused squarely on James and me. They think it was us, I said one evening, relaying what James' sister Emma had told me. Let them think it, James replied with a grin. They'll never prove it. For a little while it felt like we were in the clear, that is, until James' parents invited us over for dinner. Now let me tell you something about his folks. They've always tried to stay neutral when it comes to Brad and James, the classic "we love both our sons equally" routine. But the second we walked into their house I sensed something was different. Dinner that night was tense. No garden updates, no talk of TV shows, just quiet chewing, heavy glances, and a conversation that was clearly coming. Dinner at James's parents' house was unusually quiet. His mother, normally chatty and warm, barely said a word as she served the roast chicken and passed around side dishes. His father, who was often jovial and full of random stories, sat with a furrowed brow and lips pressed into a firm line. After the dishes were cleared and the awkward silence became unbearable, his mom finally cleared her throat. So, she began cautiously, we've been hearing things about Brad's wedding. James, ever the picture of composure, tilted his head with feigned curiosity. Oh, what kind of things? She exchanged a glance with James's father, who sighed heavily. Brad and Stephanie think someone was behind what happened during the ceremony. They suspect it might have been you two. I felt James tense beside me, the muscles in his arm tightening ever so slightly. Before he could say anything, I decided to take the lead. "Why would they think that?" I asked, keeping my voice light, neutral, curious. His dad frowned. "Well, it did seem a little strange, all those women showing up with those letters. That kind of thing doesn't just happen. And you've never exactly been on great terms with Brad." James let out a slow breath and leaned forward. "All right," he said plainly, "it was us." His mother gasped, one hand covering her mouth in disbelief. His dad's expression turned stony. "You're serious?" he asked, his voice low. "Yes," I added, looking directly at them. "We planned it." Before they could explode, I continued. "But before you judge us or get angry, we need you to understand why. This wasn't just some petty prank. We weren't being vindictive for fun. We laid it all out. The night of the engagement party, when I overheard Brad and Stephanie whispering about ruining our wedding, their plan to drive wedges between me and my bridesmaids, the cruel speech Stephanie had plotted to embarrass me in front of everyone we loved. We told them how they'd laughed about it like it was all just part of some twisted game. I described the disgust I felt listening to them gloat over how they'd make our day a disaster." James nodded solemnly. "We didn't want to do it, but after everything they've pulled over the years, this was the last straw. It wasn't about revenge. It was about protecting our day, our moment, from being destroyed by people who couldn't stand to let us be happy." His mother looked stricken, not with anger at us, but with sadness over the cruelty her other son had displayed. "Are you sure they were really planning all that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I heard every word," I said firmly. "They didn't care how it would hurt us. They just wanted attention. They wanted to steal our joy and make a mockery of everything we'd worked so hard for." His dad sat back in his chair, rubbing his temples with both hands. "You shouldn't have stooped to their level," he muttered, "but I can't say I blame you." His mom finally nodded. "It's painful to hear, but if what you're saying is true, I understand. I just wish it hadn't come to this." The conversation ended on a tense but ultimately understanding note. They didn't condone what we'd done, but they couldn't deny that Brad and Stephanie had brought it on themselves. We left their house that night feeling a bit lighter. For once, James's parents weren't rushing to defend Brad. They were seeing him, really seeing him for who he was. Over the next few days, the storm continued to swirl around Brad and Stephanie. They were still poking around, trying to figure out who had orchestrated the debacle at their wedding. But James' parents gave them nothing. Emma called us a few days later with a grin in her voice. Mom pulled Brad aside and told him to quit badgering the family about the wedding. Apparently, he acted all wounded and tried to say he was the real victim. But she wasn't having it. Shut him down real quick. As for Stephanie, her social media started to change. The vague, passive-aggressive posts began to taper off. What followed were overly cheerful updates, photos of brunches, inspirational quotes about happiness, and a ton of staged couple selfies. It was like she was trying to scream, "Everything's fine" to the world, but the cracks were visible. A mutual friend spilled that Stephanie had been venting to anyone who'd listen about how someone had sabotaged her special day. "It's just so unfair," she'd reportedly whined. Instead, her parents were pressuring Brad to fix things before the scandal tainted their family name even further. James and I, though, we finally got to relax. With the chaos of Brad and Stephanie's implosion behind us, we could focus on our wedding. We kept it intimate, personal, and surrounded ourselves only with those we could trust. No drama, no distractions, just love. And best of all, no Brad, no Stephanie. Or so we thought. About a week before our wedding, James got a strange voicemail. It was from a coworker he hadn't spoken to in years, someone barely even on our radar. "Hey man, congrats on the wedding. Got the invite. Looking forward to seeing you both there." James looked at me, puzzled. Why would we invite him? He called the guy back to clarify, and that's when we discovered the next level of Brad and Stephanie's lunacy. Somehow, they had gotten their hands on our guest list and venue details, and sent out fake wedding invitations using phony names or impersonating people we'd never even invited. At first, we thought it had to be a mistake. Who even does that? But then more guests started mentioning receiving duplicate RSVPs, different fonts, slight wording changes, but similar enough to raise alarms. It became crystal clear Brad and Stephanie were trying to sneak into our wedding. Their plan: show up disguised under fake names or with plus ones that weren't invited, cause a scene, and once again steal the spotlight. But thankfully, we were ready. After what happened at their wedding, we'd taken precautions. We hired professional security for the venue. Every single guest had to check in with ID, no exceptions. At first, it felt a little paranoid, but now, we were grateful we'd taken it seriously. When our wedding day arrived, everything was flawless. James and I were buzzing with anticipation, nervous, excited, giddy. Guests began to arrive in a steady stream. Laughter, hugs, the soft strains of music floated through the air. The staff was incredible, the venue perfect, and security, impeccable. It was shaping up to be the most beautiful day of our lives. And then, it happened, they showed up. I didn't see it with my own eyes, but the moment our wedding planner rushed toward me with alarm in her expression, I knew. Her eyes were wide, her voice low and urgent. "We have a situation at the entrance," she whispered. "A couple is trying to get in. They're claiming to be family." My stomach dropped. "Is it Brad and Stephanie?" I asked. She nodded grimly. James and I had anticipated this possibility. We'd agreed beforehand that if they tried to crash our wedding, we wouldn't engage. No drama, no confrontations. We'd leave it to security. So I took a breath, steadied myself, and said, "Stick to the plan. Make sure they don't get in. We're not dealing with them today." Meanwhile, at the entrance, Brad was in full performance mode, dressed in an expensive-looking suit. He stood before the security checkpoint with exaggerated indignation, trying to bluff his way past. "This is my brother's wedding," he argued, raising his voice as if volume could override protocol. "You can't keep me out of my own family's celebration." Stephanie was standing next to him, arms crossed, lips pursed, dressed in an elegant gown that might have turned heads, if she weren't spewing fury. "We're on the guest list," she snapped. "This is ridiculous." But our head of security, a calm, no-nonsense professional we'd hired for exactly this reason, didn't budge. "Your names aren't on the official list," he replied evenly. "And without an invitation or valid ID, I cannot allow you to enter." Brad's face turned a deep shade of red. "This is family business," he bellowed. "You have no right." Stephanie lost her composure entirely. "This isn't over," she screamed, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at the guard. "You'll regret this." Unfazed, the guard calmly escorted them back to their car, ignoring their shrieking protests. They had no power here, no allies, and no access. By the time they finally drove off, most of our guests were already inside, blissfully unaware of the drama that had almost tainted the day. From that moment on, everything was flawless. Standing at the altar with James, surrounded by the people we trusted and loved, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. This moment, this day, was ours. No bitterness, no sabotage, just joy. Our ceremony was everything we had dreamed of, emotional, heartfelt, and deeply personal. We laughed, we cried, and we celebrated our journey with those who genuinely supported us. As we exchanged vows, I felt the last remnants of anxiety dissolve. Brad and Stephanie were gone. Their influence, their games, they no longer had any hold on us. In the days that followed, word began to spread about what had happened at the venue entrance. A few guests had witnessed Brad and Stephanie being turned away and had no qualms about recounting every embarrassing detail. The story traveled quickly, and as it made its rounds, people were equal parts shocked and delighted. The once mighty power couple had been publicly shut down. Apparently, Brad and Stephanie had been whining to anyone who'd listen, spinning tales about how unfair it was, how cruelly they'd been treated. But instead of gaining sympathy, their tantrums only made them look more pitiful. People rolled their eyes, laughing at their audacity. It didn't take long for their carefully constructed image to start crumbling. About a month after the wedding, we heard from a mutual friend that Stephanie had finally reached her breaking point. She had started digging, really digging, into Brad's past, and what she found was far worse than even we had exposed. He'd lied about his finances, exaggerated his career achievements, and misled her about major parts of their relationship, including how much he actually contributed to their wedding plans. Apparently, there was a massive confrontation. Shouting, accusations, tears. Stephanie packed her things and walked out, cold, final. Brad didn't take it well. From what we heard, he tried calling her repeatedly, bombarding her with messages, even showing up at her parents' house in a last-ditch effort to win her back. But she was done. For the first time in his life, Brad was facing the consequences of his actions, and there was no one left to rescue him, no family to shield him, no fiancé to clean up the mess. As for James and me, we were thriving. Our wedding was perfect, unmarred by the negativity others had tried to inject into it. We'd moved into our new home, spent weekends curled up together, reliving the most beautiful moments of our day. Our friends visited often, and laughter filled the rooms where silence used to live. We cut Brad and Stephanie out of our lives, and it was the best decision we ever made. No more toxicity, no more one-sided family politics, just peace. They tried to ruin our joy, tried to hijack our happiness, but all they succeeded in doing was destroying their own fragile house of cards, And sometimes, poetic justice isn't just poetic, it's necessary.